The G20 met in Hamburg in July. This club of great powers, economic and political, usually meets to agree coordination on the future development of a liberal world order. The mantra is free markets, privatisation, deregulation and investors' rights across borders, often coupled with a gesture towards climate change, women's rights, development and poverty. This time it was a little different. This time the US wasn't choreographing an emerging consensus because President Trump represents a break with that consensus. That troubled and disturbed global media, who evinced an extraordinary yearning for the days of assured US dominance. Let's look at how it unfolded. Trump went in a belligerent mood, auguring a clash of civilizations in his Warsaw speech. In The Guardian's words, this pitted the Western world against barbarians at the gates. But it also attacked Russia, part of Trump's ongoing effort to refashion himself as a Cold War-style nationalist hawk. Putin, for his part, opened the talks with a direct attack on Trump's protectionism and stance on climate change. In an article for the German newspaper Handelsblatt, Putin wrote, "Protectionism is becoming the norm, while unilateral politically motivated restrictions on trade and investment, as well as technology transfer, are nothing but masked protectionism." Chinese President Xi Jinping, as Reuters reported, also engaged in a coded attack on Trump, calling for a multilateral trade regime and openness. But this was just the beginning. The Washington Post, spokesperson of the DC establishment, lamented, "At G20, world aligns against Trump policies ranging from free trade to climate change." CNN's coverage had a similar flavour, noting that the summit had closed with rebuke to Trump's climate change stance. Because of Donald Trump, The Independent put it, the world no longer looks to America for leadership. Jeffrey Sachs, economist and co-architect of the Washington Consensus, writing for the Hindustan Times, lauded Merkel for working around Trump to secure consensus minus America at the G20. There was, in this vein, a great deal of international liberal press excitement about a viral video clip of an Australian journalist, Chris Ullman, critiquing Trump's G20 role. Using the language of clickbait websites, The Guardian enthused, "Australian journalist demolishes Trump at G20, biggest threat to the West." Similar clickbaity tones appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald, which announced, "Trump presidency's dishonesty exposed." But what was the frenzy all about? Ullman's clip was a statement to camera, a lamentation for the death of the Washington Consensus. He lamented in particular that Trump had
no desire and no capacity to lead the world. He will cede that power to China and Russia. Some will cheer the decline of America, but I think we'll miss it when it's gone. And that's the biggest threat to the values of the West.
Intriguingly, the Washington Post reports that Ullman is a somewhat conservative figure in his own country who has railed against cultural Marxism. Ullman had written for The Australian endorsing the whole Trumpian conspiracy theory about the Frankfurt School infiltrating and subverting American freedom. Crank though he may be, however, Ullman was celebrated because he had given voice to the views of the global neoliberal centre about the Trump administration, views which they tend to mistake for those of the world. As always when the world's political elites gather to organise world economic policy, there were big protests there to greet them, this time marching under the punchy banner of "Welcome to Hell." What were the protests about? Going by the coverage, they were about fires, looting and riots. As CNN put it, G20 protesters set street fires, loot stores. Characteristic of such pieces, CNN spent most of its opening paragraphs describing the drama of back-and-forth battles between police and protesters. A similar pattern obtained elsewhere. The BBC offered viewers exciting footage of clashes between anti-G20 protesters and the police, and photos of violence at G20 protests. CBC highlighted clashes between protesters and police as G20 march turns violent. ABC Australia reported that G20 protesters bringing criminal violence to Hamburg put locals offside. Ironically, the reactionary tabloid The Express offered more substantive description and quotation from the protesters than the BBC or other broadcasters, albeit in the cause of scaremongering as protests turn violent. Much of the coverage of this focused on the supposed damage to Germany's image, with the FT suggesting that Merkel was under fire for choosing to host the meeting in a liberal city with a history of radical protests. As Reuters reports, even the Social Democrat German foreign minister blamed Merkel for the violence, risking, as Deutsche Welle reported, tearing the coalition government apart. This was a strange diversion, as if the problem was merely one of booking the right venue. There have been protests at every single G20 summit. These included the summits in London in 2009 and Toronto in 2010. The problem is self-evidently not the location, but what the G20 represents. These people would attract protests almost wherever they went. But this coverage, focused on violence as the main story, corroborated the global political and economic elites in their determination to make protest harder. As The Guardian reported, the violence had led to calls for new curbs on anti-capitalist militants. The German Justice Minister, representing the leading state in Europe, which many liberals now believe to be the leader of the free world, pledged money to help suppress the anti-capitalist left, arguing that the protests must be a turning point in our view of the left-wing scene's readiness to use violence. He also called for the development of a Europe-wide database of left-wing extremism, accessible by all European countries. But what is the truth behind the headlines? First of all, this was the most heavily policed summit in recent years, with 20,000 officers deployed in Hamburg. As protest participant Shreko Horvat pointed out, they were heavily armed and backed up by drones and the latest surveillance technology. There are only 30,000 police officers in the whole of Germany, so this was a major commitment. As The Guardian reported, this was accompanied by fear-mongering on the part of the police chief, who warned of massive assaults and complaints from locals about heavy-handed police who they said had ratcheted up tensions in the city. The left-wing German newspaper TASS accused the police of professional escalation, which, if it had taken place in St. Petersburg, would be considered a violation of the basic right to freedom of assembly. Second, the first day's protest began, according to the Deutsche Welle, peacefully. Its reporter Max Hoffmann said that the feeling at the Welcome to Hell protest is that of a large family gathering. Footage from the event showed protesters calmly gathering to hear speeches and prepare for a march that was scheduled to go into the city centre. Third, it was police who escalated, beginning at approximately 5:30 p.m. when, according to BBC journalist Jenny Witt, riot police began deploying throughout the crowds. Then, as the march began to move, the police blocked it after moving just 300 feet, using dozens of armed vehicles to obstruct the path. They claimed to be doing this because a small contingent of the 12,000-strong crowd were refusing to remove their face masks. They then began to order non-protesters to disperse in preparation for combat. Matthias Wisbar, an emergency legal advisor present at the protests, told Der Spiegel that the police intervention was definitely not legal, as multiple reports had confirmed there had been no violence from the protesters. By 7 p.m, police had turned the water cannon on a section of the protesters, as shown here in Guardian footage, and this was the context in which some protesters began to throw bottles and stones at riot cops. Even the BBC, which had dedicated a lot of coverage to violence, acknowledged that there are about 100,000 protesters in Hamburg for the G20, and all but a very few are peaceful. In fact, there is a range of events going on, including an alternative summit, which was arranged by a group of NGOs, political parties and others ahead of the two-day G20. It also noted that the protesters blamed the cops. The people had been provoked by police. Meanwhile, not one politician from the government of Hamburg has come onto the streets to de-escalate the situation. In short, the violence was overwhelmingly on the side of the state, not the protesters, and had been prepared for and escalated for in advance. The total picture you get of G20 from the media thus comprises three parts: scorn for Trump's ineptitude and unwillingness to lead, hymns to global unity minus America, and vilification of violent protesters outside. In a sense, the Ullmans, the Sachs and the Summers are right. Trump plainly has neither the desire nor the ability to sustain a US hegemonized liberal world order. What they are wrong about is that the rest of the world is unified. It isn't, even when the rest of the world means the powerful state leaderships. As Thomas Wright argues in The Atlantic, the G20 is increasingly passé because it is based on an elite agreement on the convergence towards a liberal world order that simply no longer exists. The EU, Russia and China have a very different perception of the future. What is more, the emphasis on the violence of the protesters avoided the unpleasant truths they might have to tell. The Welcome to Hell protesters, in their call to action, argued that the promises of growth and prosperity cannot be fulfilled anymore, even in the metropolises, causing right-wing populism, militant nationalism and authoritarian ideologies to thrive. They argued that the age of neoliberal globalization and its iron fist of war is faltering, neither free trade nor regime change availing. In order to avoid a world of competitive blocs and major military rivalries, the protesters argued, it is necessary to build alternatives now. This is not, however, a message which a media, nostalgic for the zenith of globalization and American leadership, is able to hear, much less convey.